Hello, this is Jack Fenn, Vice President of the Civil War Study Group here at Lake of the Woods, Virginia. Welcome to this, the recording of our program on February the 23rd, 2024.
Good morning and welcome. I'm Jack Fenn, the Vice President of the Civil War Study Group, and you may wonder why you have to settle for second best. If you think about it, it would have been rather unkind, wouldn't it, if we had our august president stand up here and welcome you and introduce himself. So I've taken over the first part of that. I'd like to welcome you today to the study group. Looks like a very nice turnout this morning, and I'm sure that you'll be enriched by Charles's presentation today. I do have this one question for you. Are there people who are present today who have never been at one of our Civil War Study Group meetings in the past? Because we want, great. Oh my God, yeah, okay. Well, very good. We're happy to have you here. And we also want to point out, there's a tall table back over here in the corner, and on it there's a clipboard and pen. If you would like to be on our mailing list to get updates on our various activities as well as the events, the presentations that are done here on the third Friday morning of the month throughout the year, please sign up. We want you to know that your information is kept confidential. We use a BCC method to make sure that your email is not sent to every member of our organization, and certainly not to anyone outside. Okay. At any rate, so I'll call that to your attention again before the end of the meeting, because we would like to make sure that we keep in contact. And by the way, also on that table, you'll find some what look like business cards for our organization. There is the organizational website where you can see what events are coming up and also view recordings of past events for the last almost 3-4 years now. And there's a QR code. If you're into QR codes, it'll pop that right up on whatever device you're using. Okay. Can I remind you, speaking of that, if you have not already checked your phones to make sure that if it's not AT&T, you've turned it off. We'll get a real comedian to come in. Anyway, before we begin, I want to call your attention to 4 things. You know, many things go dormant here in this part of the country during the winter, but the Civil War Study Group isn't one of them. If you live here at the lake, you may have gone past the Woods Center, where you may have seen a new location for our artifact cabinet. And I personally think it's an excellent location, and we owe Joe Rokas and the clubhouse manager, Brian Richardson, for the opportunity to move the artifacts cabinet perhaps into a better location from where it had been here at the clubhouse previously. So have a look. And if you have a complaint, where are our board members this morning? I know there's some here. We have Charles, of course, Dee Egelhard, Craig Rain, and Greg Majors. I'm not missing anyone else. If you have any suggestions about speakers or various other matters, please let us know. If you'd also like to hear about how you can contribute to our organization, you can speak to one of us too after the meeting. But there are no dues. No. Anyway, let me begin. So 4 things that I'd like to mention. The first, if you go by Spotswood Park here at Lake of the Woods, you'll notice that there's a restored, there are 2 restored and updated information panels there on that site of what was once Orange Grove Plantation. These were replaced with the generous support of Helen and Charles Brewer and the Lake of the Woods Association's immediate past president, Terry Vickery, and her husband Doug, along with the aid of the Civil War Study Group. Okay. Second, Deke and Jill Egelhart have been working to oh, hey, Dave. Oh. You can hear me, huh? At least as much as you want to. Okay, so I'm probably getting too far. I'll be careful. Okay. At any rate, Deke and Jill Egelhart have been working to arrange the annual history poster display and competition that's held at Locust Grove and Lightfoot Elementary Schools here in Orange County. That judging will be taking place the first week or the second week of April, between the 9th and the 12th of April, and then the study group will be hosting a recognition of the best of that work here at the clubhouse in the middle of May. And while the quality of the work may vary, there are some projects that are truly astounding, and we'd like to think that in fulfillment of our goals, that we're helping to turn some of these students into lifelong history appreciators, people who will appreciate our own national history. Some of that work, as I say, is truly amazing, and we're glad that that has returned after the COVID period. Okay. Also, we'd like you to mark your calendars now for May the 3rd. That's when we'll have our annual dinner held here, again, the same location in the clubhouse at Lake of the Woods. Dinner will be served at 6:30, buffet style, and our speaker will follow this year. By the way, what's the anniversary of the Battle of the Wilderness? 5th and 6th of May, right? This is the 160th anniversary. This is as close as we could get on a Friday night, on a weekend, here at the clubhouse, to hold an event themed in that way. Our speaker will be historian and author John Michael Priest, who's a specialist in the history of the Battle of Antietam. But he'll be, and he also particularly addresses himself to the concerns of the common soldier and their sometimes great suffering on the battlefield. His presentation will be titled, "The Hell Where Youth and Laughter Go, Memories of the Wilderness." Okay. So please consider joining us for that day. And there'll be notices coming. Watch for them on our website. Okay. And then finally, getting down to the point, please join us again next month on Friday, March the 22nd, right here again, for Gene Schmiel, who the historian. He's become quite a prolific author. He's pumping out books at the rate of 3 a year now, dealing with historical personages and places associated with the Civil War. The title of his presentation will be "Civil War Trailblazers and Troublemakers." Okay. Speaking of troublemakers, turning to our speaker in just a moment, I want to introduce our immediate past president and one of our founding members of the Civil War Study Group here at Lake of the Woods, Craig Raines, who will introduce Charles this morning. So we'll turn things over to Craig.
Okay, this is not good.
A lot of introductions begin with, our speaker needs no introduction. That's almost the case today, because our speaker is the one that you've seen standing up here for the last 3 years running these meetings. But you may not know him, so I thought I'd give a little bit of background about Charles Brewer, our president and our speaker today. Charles graduated from high school in Arlington, from a school that was named for 2 slave owners. about a little later. After high school, he went on and got a bachelor's degree from James Mason University, and he later earned an MA from James Madison University and another one from Old Dominion University. So he's an educated type of person. Following a tour with the U.S. Navy, Charles spent 37 years in banking and finance and retired from Freddie Mac in 2010. He and his wife Helen acquired property here at Lake of the Woods in 2007 and became permanent residents on Small Lake in 2009. Moving to the Lake of the Woods gave Charles a great opportunity to explore his Civil War interests. He joined Friends of the Wilderness Battlefield, and for several years he was an FOWB interpreter at historic Elwood Manor for the National Park Service. When the Civil War Study Group was formed, Charles joined in 2011 when we were founded. He was elected to the board of directors in 2014, and 3 years later was elected president. Along the way, he put his creative talents to work, creating the present Civil War Study Group logo and updating our website and being directly involved in creating some of these interpretive panels that you see around the lake. Before I turn over the microphone to Charles, I want to mention his actions on behalf of the Civil War Study Group during the COVID pandemic of 2019-2020. While clubs and organizations everywhere were shutting down and mass meetings were forbidden, our board switched our meetings to Zoom rather than just shutting down. And we placed Charles in charge. Good TV show, I guess. Charles went further. He set up our YouTube channel where he uploaded these Zoom presentations, making them permanently available to an international audience. For his action on behalf of the 300 plus people who are on our email list and who follow the Civil War Study Group, Charles in 2021 was the recipient of the annual Hometown Hero Award from the Lake of the Woods Association. Coming from a high school named for two slaveholders, and I might say that one of them was a general in the American Revolutionary War, one was a general in the Civil War. Both were slaveholders. One owned 319 slaves, and one may have owned 4 slaves. It is no longer known as Washington Lee High School. It is today Washington Liberty High School. Charles, in keeping with his graduation, is dressed in blue and gray today. I think that's very nice. Actually, he spent the last 2 years, and I'm very impressed, at least the last 2 years and more, researching his topic for today, a demographic profile, the U.S. colored troops at the Battle of the Wilderness. Please welcome Charles Brewer.
Thank you very much for coming today. Let me get this set first. My grip this is really tight. In my old age, my pinch is no longer what it used to be. Sorry, Helen. Okay, there we are. And as you would know, the sniffles arrived this morning, so my apologies. Well, anyway, thank you all for coming. I'm really heartened to see this number of people interested in this topic. I'd like to dedicate my talk today to the memory of my great friend Jean Batty, who introduced me to my wife, for which I am eternally grateful, and also his passion for researching and sharing through his books the contributions and sacrifices of African Americans in our nation's wars, which has rubbed off on me. Also, I'd like to thank study group founding member Joe Rokas for the excellent research paper he prepared for my use several years ago. Those of you who were fortunate to hear Kevin Pollack's excellent presentation last month, either in person or on our YouTube channel, will remember that one of the unique parts of the January 1, 1863 final Emancipation Proclamation was the approval of the use of African Americans in the Union Army. I think we all know that in the May 1864 Battle of Wilderness was the first use of the United States colored troops in the Army of the Potomac against Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. For a number of years now, the board of the Civil War Study Group has discussed creating a new interpretive panel to honor the presence of their important contribution in a unique way. The research I'm sharing with you today is an effort to reach that goal. You'll be introduced, get my pointer here, you'll be introduced to these gentlemen later in the presentation. The USCT at Wilderness were in 7 regiments assigned to the 4th Division of Burnside's 9th Corps. As you will remember, at Wilderness, the 9th Corps was not part of the Army of the Potomac because of Army protocol. General Burnside was a senior officer to George Meade and thus reported directly to Ulysses Grant. The 4th Division was led by this gentleman, Edward Ferraro, Brigadier General Edward Ferraro. As you can see, he was a popular dance instructor to elite New Yorkers and also West Point cadets. On the side, he dabbled in military studies. At the outbreak of the war, he founded and funded the 51st New York Volunteers. He had a good record until the crater, during which he was reportedly drunk at the back, not leading his troops to the front. Despite that, he was breveted a major general in December of '64 and continued serving through Appomattox. According to Ferrero's after report, his division was at Manassas Junction when he answered orders by breaking camp on May 4th, reaching Catlett Station at 2 a.m. On May 5. After several hours of rest, the march continued at 8 a.m. and reached Mountain Run by 6 p.m. that day. We don't know exactly where on Mountain Run they were, but I've placed it approximately where modern-day Carico Mill Road crosses over Mountain Run. The march resumed at 4 a.m. the morning of May 6th, crossed the Rapidan at Germanna Ford, and relieved troops guarding the bridge. At one point in his report, Ferrero admits that at Wilderness, disposition of his troops was directed by General Grant himself. So the 4th Division was guarding the bridge at Germanna and largely securing the supply train, which at more than 4,000 wagons stretched for miles. At around 8:30 p.m. On the 6th, after the unfolding of Gordon's flank attack, Grant ordered Ferrero to continue securing the plank road and bridge and to move the train back across Germanna Ford and move down to recross the Rapidan at Ely's Ford Road. By 8 a.m. the next morning, they had recrossed the Rapidan and reported that fact to Grant. While for the remainder of the Overland campaign, the 4th Division remained essentially out of combat, there was one instance in which combat was faced. On May 15th, during the Battle of Spotsylvania Courthouse, the 23rd USCT were successfully used to essentially save the 2nd Ohio Cavalry, pinned down by a superior Confederate cavalry force. However, the division's non-combatant status changed once the siege of Petersburg began in June, and most certainly up to and during the Battle of the Crater. From the 9th Corps order of battle, we know that the 4th Division had about 3,400 troops available. The approach my research took was to obtain some familiarity with who these men were. They enlisted despite Northern racist assumptions about their bravery and skill. They enlisted despite knowledge that if captured by Confederate forces, their lives were at certain risk. They enlisted despite pay disparity. With respect to pay disparity, white troops were paid $10 a month plus an additional $3 for clothing allowances, etc. However, the USCT were paid at $10 a month, from which $3 a month was taken out for clothing, etc. That disparity was closed in the fall of 1864 after several USCT regiments refused to go forward without pay equity. The adjustment was retroactive. The typical enlistment was a free man of color. This man's record, which available on the fold3.com database, my primary source, had a total of 22 documents, mostly bi-monthly muster cards. As you can see, an enlistment form had to be signed. In this case, the enlistee was literate. The demographic information on the enlistee was on these two cards. This is an example of one of the bi-monthly muster cards in the file. And then upon mustering out, this man had a stop placed on, a $6 stop placed on his, the money due him because he was taking a musket with him and also some equipment related to the musket. I'll introduce you to this gentleman in the last part of my presentation. Both black and white troops sent a portion of their money home, so a stop like this could affect their family as well. Here's a list of other stops that I saw, as little as 23 cents for a wrench, as much as $6.50 for a tent. So, you know, if you were picking up only $7, even if you were picking up $10 a month, if you lost a tent, that would be a big hit for the income that you're sharing with your family. This is a quick side note, a quick sweeping view of the summary sheet from the Excel workbook housing my research. So the principal assignment of the 4th Division was to guard the supply train. Some troops, however, were assigned to detached service, such as pioneer fatigue, quartermaster, ambulance nurse, sharpshooter. The pioneer fatigue units were assisting other units in tasks such as construction of field fortifications, military camps, bridges, and roads. This was risky work in that they often preceded troops to make things ready. In these 7 regiments, total enlistments during the war were over 12,000. However, up through April 30th of '64, enlistments were just shy of 5,000. My criteria for review was I assumed that there was a certain amount of time for training prior to putting the troops in the field. So my cutoff was April 7th, which is 1 month before the May 7th end of the Battle of the Wilderness. And also, I did not include those sick or in hospital at April 30th, nor those deserted or dead at April 30th. I did, however, my review time frame went past the Overland campaign through the crater on July 30th, but also for those that were wounded at the crater, I went beyond July into October to see if they had died from their wounds. The regimental headquarters for the 7 regiments were as follows. Camp Delaware, sorry, I got someone's eyeball there. Camp Delaware outside Columbus, Ohio for the 27th. Hart Island in the Long Island Sound for the 31st. Philadelphia, Pennsylvania for the 43rd. Baltimore, Maryland for the 39th. Washington, D.C. for the 23rd. And Camp Stanton in Maryland's Charles County for the 19th and 30th. So the total reviewed actually ended up being a little over 3,700 because I took out the various things that I told you about earlier. And what I didn't mention is that almost 600 enlistees were transferred to the United States Navy. But it's close enough for to set up a good view of who these men were. So the 27th, 100% of the enlistees were from these various counties. Oops, sorry about that. From these various counties in Ohio, the red dot, and Camp Delaware is the green dot there. And as you can see, over 50% were born in Ohio or contiguous states, 2 of them being border states. And then 49%, however, were born in seceded states, i.e. the South. And of course, as most of you probably know, Ohio was one of the principal destinations in the Underground Railroad. The 31st at Hart Island, New York, as you can see, there's a good distribution in the various counties, and the 57% were recruited in New York, and 36% were recruited in neighboring Connecticut. Enlistees were mostly born in New York or the contiguous states, but however, once again, they did have a significant portion born in the South, probably escaped or emancipated slaves. The 43rd in Pennsylvania, 89% were recruited in Pennsylvania, 8% in Maine, New Jersey, and Delaware. Most were born in Pennsylvania and contiguous states, but once again, a significant portion from born in the South. The 23rd in D.C., 85% were recruited in D.C., 14% in Baltimore. The regimental headquarters for the 23rd Corps was at Camp Casey, Virginia, which they've determined is near modern-day Pentagon. And then almost half of them were born in Maryland, with a very significant portion born in the South, mostly in Virginia. The Maryland regiments were mostly, almost totally recruited in-state, and you can see from each of these regiments, the distribution of the states, of the counties, is mostly in the eastern part of the state. So very few were recruited in the western part of the state. And as you can see, 97% were born in state, and the remainder in seceded states. Unlike the non-Maryland regiments, 22% of the enlistees in these Maryland regiments were slaves enlisted by their slaveholders. The compensation the slaveholder received was based upon a regimen developed for the April '62 emancipation of slaves in the District of Columbia. Slaveholders were paid $300 for each slave enlisted, not an insignificant sum at the time. As you can see, there's where the slaves were. As you can see, most of the slave enlistments came from the more agricultural eastern half of the state. In addition to the enlistment, bi-monthly muster cards, etc., additional documents required the slaveholder to prove ownership. Remember that the slavery system allowed human beings to be owned. Legal frameworks were in place to prove ownership, such as our modern day title to our cars, to our land. In this case, title to a human being. And so you see here, he had to, have an evidence of title. So as you can, one of the things that the slaveholder had to do was manumit free the slave. They had to sign an oath of allegiance to the United States government, and 3 known loyal citizens had to vouch for the fact that they were loyal to the United States government. A board of claims would reveal all the documentation and make a decision. In this case, the enlistment occurred in February of '64, and payment was eventually made in October of that year. Here are a few other examples. Also in February of '64, these two here weren't paid until '65, one in February, one in October. There were even instances where the enlistee died even before the Overland campaign began, and the slaveholder was paid. There were some late claims, 1867, and then there were some instances where slaveholders were not paid, and that could have been almost anything, such as not being able to prove that they were a loyal citizen. But anyway, certain identifying information was collected, such as the age, height, their complexion, their birthplace, their occupation. In this case, this gentleman was a black or dark complexion. In this case, the gentleman was a griff complexion, which was defined as 75% black, 25% white. And in this case, the gentleman was mulatto complexion, which was defined as an indeterminate racial mix. I'll introduce you to each of these gentlemen near the end. As you can see, in the non-Maryland regiments, for those born in the North, only 21% were mixed race. However, for those in those four regiments born in the South, the total is 35% mixed race. As we've seen earlier, almost all the Maryland troops were born in state, and slightly over 46% were mixed race. These larger mixed race percentages in these last two graphs are partially explained as the result of the prevalent rape culture amongst the slaveholding class. So as far as age, the minimum age was 14, the median age, exactly in the middle, was 23, and the oldest was 65. Imagine 65 going to battle, my God. But in any event, one of the things that really held my interest was that over 13% of the total are 35 years or older. Given the really hard work that most of these men probably did during their lives, 35 would have been old age. I think that's amazing that they would go to battle. So the total occupations coming into the service were mainly, as you can see, farmer and laborer. These two combined total 83%. The laborer designation probably denotes that the individuals sought day labor opportunities where they could to make a living. A small proportion waiter and sailor. And then the remaining 12% were a variety of different specialized things, such as, I can't see it from here, but you can see, okay, so an oysterman, a tailor, what is that? Shoemaker, thank you so much. A minister, merchant, lawyer, house doctor, engineer, cigar maker, and an ambrotypist, which Jack should interest you. Do you know what an ambrotypist is? They're the ones that colored the photographs. Jack is quite expert at Civil War era photographs. As a matter of fact, one of his presentations, which you can look at on our YouTube channel, has that in it. So 16% of total enlistees attained NCO status as of April 30th, 1864. 32% of those had skilled occupations upon enlistment. I was interested in determining whether there was some preference of lighter skin in promotions, but the data suggests otherwise. Almost half were black, dark complexion. And as a matter of fact, Those enlistees, actually a slightly larger percentage, were skilled. Obviously, with only like 34% of skilled, that means that 65% were unskilled, farmer, whatever. So that says to me that the leaders of the various companies sought out leadership skills. Now, there's evidence, I saw evidence of in several cases where they were demoted after maybe the first conflict, and because they didn't, I guess, meet up to the leadership qualities, but it does seem to me that they sought true leadership skills. While there were some desertions as the Overland campaign progressed, the bulk occurred in the Petersburg vicinity. 3 of the 7 regiments had much smaller desertion rates than the other 4. Quote, most USCT officers were chosen for their abolitionist views. Abolitionists were not necessarily free of racism. Many thought of abolition as a matter of liberalized labor, not social revolution. They assumed that contractual wage labor would replace slavery in the Army as well as elsewhere in the restored Union, unquote. As a result, these company leaders' day-to-day behavior towards their troops may have seemed to too many as too close to the dreaded overseer. 12% of the enlistees at Wilderness were wounded, mostly on July 30th, either at the Crater or Cemetery Hill. 14% of these subsequently died of their wounds through October of '64. Only 5% of the troops leaving the Wilderness later ended up losing in action. The bulk occurred in and around Petersburg, and then at least 22% of these were later determined to have been prisoners of war. Here's an example of Mildy Finnick, who was manumitted upon his January '64 enlistment. He was captured by Confederate troops at the Crater. He was sold back into slavery to a plantation west of Richmond. Given the probable regional chaos at the time, he was able to escape on April 8, '65 and return to his regiment. He died in 1917 and is buried in the colored section of Arlington National Cemetery. In my research, there were a number of similar scenarios, including sale all the way down into the Carolinas, wherein the troops managed to escape and return to their regiments. Almost half of those, only 5% of those at Wilderness were killed in action, and almost half of them met that fate at the Crater. Another 6% died of disease. As you can see, diarrhea and typhoid fever accounted for over 60% of those deaths. Now I'd like you to show you the faces of some of the brave men who passed through this land in May of 1864. This is a picture from the fall 2016 issue of Military Images. This is a burial detail at Louverture Hospital in Alexandria, Virginia in the fall of 1864. Louverture Hospital was one of the hospitals set up specifically for the black troops. God forbid there should be any immigration. Tobias Trout, of the 31st, was 34 years old when he mustered in January of '64. He was born in Oxford, North Carolina, was a farmer. He was wounded at the Crater and eventually died in April '65 at Louverture from gangrene of the lungs. He is buried in Alexandria National Cemetery. Leander Brown of the 30th was 23 years old when he mustered in February of '64. He was born in Charles County, Maryland, was a waiter, and he was wounded at the Crater, and he mustered out from Louverture in May of '65. Samuel Bond of the 19th was a 19-year-old slave enlistee mustered in December of '63. He was born in Baltimore, Maryland, was a farmer. He was wounded 2 days before the crater on July 28th. He died in 1865 in Brownsville, Texas, of dysentery. Adam Bentley, also of the 19th, was a 25-year-old slave enlistee, also mustered in December of '63. He was born in Kent, Maryland, was a farmer. He was wounded at the crater, and he mustered out in June of '67 at Brownsville, Texas. Most of the men in this photograph signed a petition protesting the burial of deceased comrades in the Freedman Cemetery rather than the cemetery created for the USCT. Their efforts bore fruit as 138 reburials eventually occurred. This is Nimrod Burke of the 23rd. He was born in 1836 in Prince William County to a father who was amongst those freed by Robert Carter III through his 1795 deed of gift. This was the largest private emancipation of slaves until the Civil War. Nimrod's family lived in the Bull Run quarter of Prince William until 1854, when they relocated to Washington County, Ohio. Nimrod was not only a farmer, but also a handyman doing work for Marietta, Ohio attorney Melvin Clark. At the war's outbreak, Nimrod was refused entry into the service because of his race. Clark, however, gave him a place as a wagon teamster and scout in his own 36th Ohio Infantry. Oops, I shouldn't. Yeah, that's right. Nimrod continued serving in that capacity beyond Clark's 1862 death at Antietam until he transferred in March of '64 to the 23rd USCT. He returned to Ohio after the war, resumed farming, and lived until 1914. There's his tombstone. Let me quote from Kevin Pollack's 2014 Emerging Civil War article on Nimrod. Quote, Nimrod Burke was born a free man because Robert Carter III freed his ancestors. He served in the United States Army because Abraham Lincoln made it possible. He fought to ensure that others of his race could experience the largest emancipation of enslaved men, women, and children in American history. This is a story revealed in a new book by local historian Sam Nelson. Qualls Tibbs was born in Orange, near town, and was amongst the enslaved people manumitted in a will around 1842 when Qualls was about 5 years of age. He and many others from that estate then relocated to Ohio, which was a requirement of Virginia law at the time. In February of '64, he enlisted in an Ohio colored regiment and was promoted to sergeant within 2 months. As part of the 27th USCT, he found himself crossing the Rappahannock in May of '64 en route to the Rapidan and the wilderness. His life story indicates that he was a man of intelligence and was aware of the consequences should he be caught wearing the Union blue. He was not caught, however, returning to Ohio after the war and living a full life, dying at 86 in 1922 in Lancaster, Ohio. The uniform buttons on the right, one side with his name, the other side with his regiment, are on display at the American Museum of African American History and Culture in D.C. Decatur Dorsey of the 39th was a March '64 slave enlistee from Howard County, Maryland. He was awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor for picking up fallen regimental colors during the Battle of the Crater, rallying fellow troops to return to face the enemy, although eventually repulsed given a favorable Confederate position. During the charge up the mountain, there were reports of colored troops shouting, "Remember Fort Pillow." That was a massacre of colored troops at Fort Pillow, Tennessee, less than a month earlier, who, once overwhelmed and surrendered, were not taken as POWs, but were massacred by troops under the command of General Nathan Bedford Forrest, known after the war as one of the founders of the KKK. Dorsey died in 1891 in Hoboken, New Jersey. I have study group founding member Craig Raines to thank for this image. This 18-year-old was born in Cincinnati, Ohio, enlisted in January 1864 in Cuyahoga County, and was made the regimental drummer boy. Enlisting on the same day, also in Cuyahoga County, was one Joseph Anderson, 39 years old, born in Tennessee. Both were assigned to Company B. Could Joseph be William's father? Especially in the Maryland regiments, I encountered a number of instances of the same last name, muster date, and location, and also an age range suggesting family enlistments. One of the stories I remembered learning during my Elwood training years ago was about 3 Union picketers being caught by Confederates, taken to Orange Courthouse, and the lone USCT amongst them hung in front of the other 2. As you can see, 18-year-old Albert Fritchett was shown as missing in action effective May 6, 64, near Germanna Ford. One of the things that the Army tried to do after the war was to identify if any listed as missing in action had been held as POWs and their eventual disposition. In this case, there was no POW record, so I'm not sure if this identifies the lynching victim or not, but that might be my next challenge, who knows. After the crater, the 19th, 23rd, 31st, and 43rd regiments eventually were reassigned to the 25th Corps, the only all-black corps in U.S. Army history, and were present at Appomattox. The 27th, 30th, and 39th were reassigned to other corps. At Appomattox, with the 30th and 39th transferred to operations in North Carolina, the remaining 5 regiments, including the 27th, were involved through Appomattox. After the war, the 19th, 23rd, and 31st were transferred to Texas. Mustering out at the end of the war, or after the war. All 7 regiments were mustered out in different time frames. In North Carolina, in September of 65, the 27th. In December of 65, the 30th and 39th. In Pennsylvania, November of 65, the 43rd. And in Texas, in November of 65, the 23rd and 31st. And not until January of 67, the 19th. So I think that we can see that there is probably a lot of information yet to be uncovered and stories to be told. The research I did is really just only scratching the surface. There are 2 books I'd like to recommend, both available on Amazon and other sources. This is sort of an ad for the man who introduced me to my wife, but this is an excellent book. It's perhaps his best book that I've read, and I really recommend it. It has a lot of information and perspective, so once again, available on Amazon and elsewhere. And then there is James McPherson's The Negro's Civil War. This book was first published almost 60 years ago, and I wish I had found it much earlier in my journey to understand the Civil War period of our nation's history. The author uses the writings of African Americans, mostly in the North, and examines their early debates amongst themselves about participating in the white man's war, mostly letters and editorials. The prose of these communications is very revealing of deep thought and conflicted feelings about their place in the American society. The power of the writing perhaps reveals why slaveholders, in their fear, made every effort to keep their enslaved populations, as well as poor whites, by the way, in ignorance. So this is a very revealing work, and I highly recommend it. And Jack Finn might recognize it because I stole it from, he donated it to the book library that we used to have, and I took it home with me. But anyway, thank you very much for your attention. And at this point, I hope that if you have any questions, you ask them, but and hopefully I can answer them. If not, maybe another project is in the offing.
Thank you, Charles.
Yes.
Can you remind us what constituted the South and the North?
Excuse me, please?
Can you remind us what constituted the South and the North in terms of the states?
Yes. Well, at the very beginning, let me go all the way back. This is like deja vu all over again. There's no way for me to do this without going to the computer. But at any rate, there we go. Okay, so the blue is the Union, and notice the South I didn't make gray for some reason. Actually, I stole this off the internet. So the Union states, and then the yellow are the border states. So Delaware was a border state. Maryland was a border state. When it was admitted to the Union, West Virginia became West Virginia here became a border state. That's Kentucky, yes. And then Missouri. Oh, that's Tennessee. Tennessee is below that. This is Kentucky, and then Missouri or Missouri, as Dave would say. Yes. Any? Oh, yes.
Several times in your presentation you mentioned the crater. So
Yes.
can you refresh our memory?
All right.
what
So
that was?
Petersburg was under siege beginning in end of June of '64, and there was one regiment, and I don't remember which it was, but a white regiment that was peopled by miners, and they came up with a plan to dig a hole underneath the ramparts of the defenses of the Confederates there at Petersburg, and set off an explosion, and they did that. But of course, what happened was the explosion caused a crater, and that's why it's called the crater. And one thing there is originally some USCT companies or regiments were tasked with carrying out the attack after the explosion, but some white units wanted the glory, and they elbowed in. And so it wasn't as a good a result as a result of that. And there were a lot of deaths that occurred because of that. Yes, any other questions? Yes, sir.
I think your research showed that the desertion rate was on the order of 8%. I wonder if you could provide some context to that overall.
Overall, as my wife said, I should have been reading instead of looking up, but that's one thing I missed. Overall desertion rate of USCT for the entire Army for the entire war, now they were only in it in the last 18 months, was only 6%.
For the colored troops or in general?
Colored troops. I don't know what it is for, I really should have, I guess, for comparison, but I did not look up what the overall desertion rate was. Yes, ma'am.
Yes, going back to the part where the slave owners would have their slaves enlisted,
Yeah.
and they would get paid for that.
Yes.
And then, so they were enlisted in certain regiments, and then at some point later, after the war, they were mustered out.
Yes.
Were those individual slaves then emancipated?
No, they had to be emancipated before the Army would take them.
Okay, so when the slave owner, he emancipated them to the service, to the military, right?
Exactly.
So when they got out, then they were free.
Yeah. They had to do all that before they got the $300.
Right.
Their pound
Okay.
of flesh. Yes. Yes. Well, way back there.
You mentioned a couple men ended up in Brownsville, Texas.
Yes.
And was that a POW camp?
No. They were in Brownsville because, if you remember, in one of the later slides, a few of the regiments were sent to Texas. So, and as a matter of fact, some of those that were in Texas stayed in the Army, and some became Buffalo soldiers. Yes, sir. Whoa, Greg.
I have a question. A lot of us live in Lakewood Woods.
Yes.
Are there any markers
Route 3. And if you have driven down Carpenter Road, that was the site of Aldridge Farm, where the 23rd USCT came down. So in other words, the 23rd USCT was guarding the wagon train up around the Chancellorsville area when on May 15th they were called to help out the Ohio Cavalry unit. Yes?
Charles, there's a bunch of new signs in Stevensburg tell you all about. Have you seen them?
In where? Petersburg?
Stevensburg.
Oh, Stevensburg.
Yeah.
I really recommend that you go there. And for the life of me, I can't remember the sign, but they're memorializing that. And I know the time frame I forget, but I think it must have been in early '64. Not related to the Battle of the Wilderness, but several USCT were taken prisoner and I think were hung there. And it's across from a church on, help me out here, Madden's Tavern Road. So I really...
7 photos on my
Yeah.
phone,
Yeah.
along with 25,000 other phones.
Yeah, you too, okay. Yes, any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
Yes, I may have misinterpreted the slide, but when you were showing the professions,
Yes.
were those the actual slaves?
Yeah, well, not, well, a combination of slave, they were all, there were only 11% slave enlistees in the entire, all of the 7 units. But most of the ones that were slave enlistees probably were, had farmer as their occupation designation.
Because I guess I was thinking that most of, even though they had to be emancipated to serve, that when I saw the professions like lawyer, engineer, and I.
Well, those are the free men of color, probably.
Just,
Yes, any other questions? All right, well, thank you very much. Before you go, please remember to visit our website often, civilwarstudygroup.org. We make every attempt on a regular basis to provide informative content. Thank you for visiting, and God bless.